You know, it's very rare for things to get underneath my skin. For me, I'm a very calm and collected person. I usually think a lot of things through. And for me, it takes a lot of effort to actually make something like a video like this where we're going to have a little rant. And this is something that I feel like is very important and something that I've been thinking about since last night, since I've seen this, and I really wanted to talk about it and just get it off my chest. Now, last night, before I went to bed, I actually was on r/fantasy, and here I was just looking and browsing, and then I saw a post, and I looked at it, I read all the comments, and this is something that I feel like should be talked about a little more, especially when it comes to the whole scope of the fantasy genre and along with our community. So why don't we talk about this? This is the post. You can be a true fantasy fan without reading Tolkien. I'm not going to read the whole post because for me, it's better if you just read it and then look through all the comments. But this is a post that the person brings up a lot of good points about this. And personally for me, I am a huge fantasy fan. And this is something that when it comes down to it, I feel like this might be a problem actually within our community, is people pointing fingers at things, especially when it comes to, oh, if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, you're not a true fantasy fan. And I'm just gonna say right off the bat, that's a whole load of Balrog dung. And we'll talk about really, what does it mean to be a true fantasy fan, or just a fan in general, to be fanatical about anything. And this is something that I look at Lord of the Rings, yes, it is a milestone, it's really what popularized the genre to an extent. Yes, we had things like Conan the Barbarian and a lot of other sword and sorcery stories that were coming out, but Lord of the Rings really set the imagination up. And we're pretty much so disattached from Lord of the Rings. I mean, yes, it's a huge part still of our pop culture. Yes, we have the Peter Jackson movies and the really bad Hobbit movies, but does it make us a true fan for liking fantasy? Well, I want to say no, because you can be a fan or a true fan of fantasy if you like to read or you like the fantastical, if you like witches or wizards or anything in between, because I feel like this argument is pretty much like, you know, the wheels on the bus go round and round. It's just going to be perpetually going until, you know, the end of time, because you can point that to anyone. If you haven't read The Song of Ice and Fire, you're not a true fantasy fan. If you haven't read Harry Potter, you're not a true fantasy fan. If you haven't read The Name of the Wind, you ain't a true fantasy fan. And this is something that stems through, I think, a lot of people's personal attachments to a certain genre, such as fantasy, where you can kind of point fingers, just like hypothetically, and okay, this is the thing that popularized the genre, same as how Ray Bradbury or Isaac Asimov popularized a lot of science fiction in the 50s and so on and so forth. But even if we look at the dawn of the fantasy genre, you can go further back in time. Do you think people were like, man, if you haven't read Dante's Inferno, you ain't a true grimdark fantasy fan? Or if you don't like epic fantasy, you aren't a true epic fantasy fan if you haven't read Gilgamesh. Like it's funny, like we look at history, look at time, and personifications of things change and perceptions change, especially when it comes to the genre. Personally, for me, you're a fantasy fan or a true fantasy fan if you like the genre and you continue to read within it. If you like wizards, witches, dragons, treasure, anything in between. It can be urban, it can be flintlock fantasy, it can be portal fantasy, it can be grimdark. It can be anything that you find that's fantastical and you enjoy and you actually have pleasure out of it. You will find enjoyment and you are a true fantasy fan. You don't have to read huge series. Like right now, I'm sure people would be like, you're not a true fantasy fan if you haven't read The Wheel of Time. Currently reading through it, never read it through in my life. I've tried a couple times, but I didn't quite like it all that much. But that doesn't make me necessarily a not true fantasy fan. When it comes to fantasy, it is now such a huge genre. It's actually, if we really, really think about it, it's one of the most biggest money-making sellers of all time. And I'm going to use this, fantasy is a very broad thing, but fantasy is, the fantastical. Marvel movies are fantastical. They got Doctor Strange, they got magical stones, they have unbreakable shields. You have, billion-dollar stuff when it comes to this. Star Wars is space fantasy, and so on and so forth. So you can't necessarily not be a true fantasy fan if you haven't read Tolkien. There's other things that you can read. What about, like, are you a true fantasy fan if you don't know every single Arthur legend? Yes, yeah, you can. You can still be a fantasy fan that way. I mean, is there gonna be, like, if I walk into Fantasyland at Disneyland, do they have to check my nerd knowledge? I feel like that's kind of the funny, weird issue that we have, especially when it comes to this. And really, when it comes to fantasy and the genre, anyone can enjoy it and anyone can experience it. You don't necessarily need to read Lord of the Rings or The Hobbits or The Silmarillion. You're a true fantasy fan if you like anything fantastical, and that's kind of the thing that I wanted to bring. I know this was a little ranty, and I wanted this to speak more from the heart. I don't really do videos like this all this much, but I wanted to kind of talk about this and get this out of my chest. I know that I'm probably wrong about certain things and I'm right about others, maybe, who knows. But this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart because the fantasy community is so great. There's so many different options when it comes to fantasy. You can, if you think of something that probably is a book, that's why when it comes to Reddit with fantasy, you just ask someone, hey, is there a book about a dwarf shaving his beard and becoming like a rock and roll star? Oh yeah, here's like 36 options. Like that's a thing. You're a true fantasy fan if you just pursue what you love. And in the end of the day, that's all we should care about. Well, everyone, this is my little rant. I'm on my squishy soapbox, right? Actually, the soapbox that I am is a hard metal chair that hurts my butt. So I don't think I'm winning today. Well, everyone, thank you all for watching this. And like always, may your food and drink ever be tasteful, and may your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everyone. See ya.